Well, it is good to be back in the not pulpit of the office where the sound is pretty good, sharing with you again from the Word of God. As I hope you got the message earlier from before my paternity leave, our plan for the summer has been to talk about the book of John. So Maynard has been walking us through the 7 miracles of Jesus in John, and he's been doing a fantastic job of that I will rely on for a great deal of context. We had Pastor Steve Miller talk to us about the end of John, the back half of John, that we also engaged with in our Holy Week devotional. And I have left myself the charge of talking about the I am statements of John, a distinctive of John, something that is only in the Gospel of John. It's not present in Matthew, Mark, or Luke's Gospel. And so I'm going to give 7 sermons on those very important phrases in John. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on with I am statements and why they matter so much to us in John. If you can strain your brain and think back to the last time I preached a series on one of the Gospels, you will remember the series on the Gospel of Mark. And if you don't remember it, I'm going to put a link to it down in the video description. I've got a playlist, and you can rewatch those sermons. But I encouraged us to think of Mark as a book for non-Christians. It's a book that is constantly beckoning us to answer the question, who do you say Jesus is? And because it's beckoning us to answer that question, and because it's written to people who don't necessarily believe all of the truths about Jesus, haven't necessarily made Jesus our Lord yet, first of all, non-Christians have a unique perspective on it, and we can benefit from their reading of Mark, but also it doesn't say as explicitly everything about Jesus. For instance, it doesn't say explicitly that he rose from the dead. It's left, Mark wants you to come to that conclusion on your own. He doesn't want to spoon feed you. John wants to spoon feed you. John is different than Mark, and he's going to tell you from the very first verse that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Jesus is God. Jesus is the true light that is coming into the world, and as Jesus starts getting lines and talking, John puts into Jesus' mouth, I believe Jesus said these things, but John chooses to quote the things Jesus said as explicitly as he can about who Jesus said he was. And he uses a phrase. The phrase in Greek is ego eimi. I am. Now, in Greek, you don't have to use pronouns. He could have just said eimi, right? Which would be maybe equivalent to like the English I'm. You know, it's just the short way to say it. If you say eimi, that means I am. But he's like, me, myself, I am. He's being direct. He's being explicit. And he's probably doing it for a reason, because when you make the statement, I am, as opposed to am, right, or I'm, you're making a reference to Exodus chapter 3, the burning bush. Moses asks the people, when they ask me who sent me to them, who should I say? What's your name, God? And God says, tell them, I am has sent you unto thee. Right? I am is my name. This massive 4-letter important first name of God. Incredible holiness. Something that the Jews by Jesus' time wouldn't dare to utter. And so he says in Greek, I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the true vine. And as we're going to talk about today, I am the bread of life. So let's read, beginning in John chapter 6, verses 25 to 40. This is right after the passage that Maynard read us a couple of weeks ago when he was talking about the miracle of the loaves and the fishes. Right? Jesus did a miracle to provide bread for the people. That's one of the 7 miracles that Jesus performs in the book of John that are part of John's goal, his central thesis statement of getting us to realize that Jesus is God and he can do miracles and he's worthy of us following him. And then after he does it, we have Jesus sit some people down and teach them about the theological significance of what he did. Let's read John 6, 25 to 40. When they found him on the other side of the lake, they said to him, "Rabbi, when did you come here?" Jesus answered them, "Very truly I tell you, you are looking for me not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves. Do not work for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures, for eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For it is on him that God the Father has set his seal." Then they said to him, "What must we do to perform the works of God?" Jesus answered them, "This is the work of God, that you believe in him who he has sent." So they said to him, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, as it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat." Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. Everything that the Father gives me will come to me, and anyone who comes to me I will never drive away. For I've come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. This is indeed the will of my Father, that all who see the Son and believe in him may have eternal life, and I will raise them up on the last day." This is the word of the Lord. So, this is complicated. This isn't kid stuff, what he's saying here. There's some intense imagery and metaphor and theological statement being made. There's references to the Old Testament, manna and quail in the wilderness, and you've got to catch that. And then there's stuff about I'm bread, but I'm kind of more like manna. I'm bread that comes from heaven, and I rise, and you will be with me if you trust in me. And there's a lot that we could take out of this. You know, there's so much depth in a single word that falls from the lips of Jesus. But I think it would probably be most helpful for us if we were to get our hands dirty a little bit. We've already talked a great deal about bread in the midst of this pandemic. We dealt with it as we were preparing for communion and to practice communion virtually. But I think it would be worthwhile, especially since so many of us during this time have used the extra opportunity while we're at home to kind of learn to bake sourdough bread, if we baked some bread. So let's bake some bread together. I'm gonna make a loaf, and I want to encourage you, obviously not right now this morning, but maybe sometime this week, to actually try getting a little closer to bread. Pay attention to how bread works, and when you do, let's think theologically about bread. That way we can get some of our kinesthetic learners involved. You know, some people learn by hearing, and like me, that's how I prefer to learn, and those people are probably well and fully engaged in this time when there's so much great content going out on the internet. Some people learn better by writing, and so I am working on some writing projects to get out, but a lot of us learn best by doing, and it's so hard when we're separated from another. There's nothing to do. So let's do something. Let's make some bread, and let's see what we learn. And then we can talk about it afterwards at Zoomy Fellowship.
All right, we've got everything we need. We've got our kind of hardware over here, our measuring cups and a bowl. We've got our butter, we've got our flour, some active dry yeast, some cooking spray, salt, sugar, a little bit of milk. That's one thing in the recipe I like. It calls for milk. That may not be in every bread recipe. And we've got our laptop. That's my cookbook. I know some of you use cookbooks on paper. I like the internet, and I will share the website, The Simple Dollar, where I got this recipe. So to start with, it calls for some warm water in a bowl to activate our active dry yeast. Now, if you're making bread, there is, like many things, an easy way and a hard way. The easy way is with active dry yeast. The hard way would be with a sourdough starter. But first thing we want to do is make sure our bowl that we're going to bloom the yeast in is nice and warm. So we run some warm water. And of course, many of you are going to recognize this kitchen. I decided to do this here in the church kitchen so that we neither interrupt nor get interrupted by any crying babies back home. And I just let it run until it starts to feel warm. So we're not there yet. There we go. That's pretty warm. And I'm going to give it a cup of warm water, and then we'll just add our yeast to this. Okay, we've got our warm water. We've got our yeast. And the first step is to wait. That's actually going to be a pretty common step in this bread making process. This is a living thing, yeast, and it's got to grow and replicate, have babies, and eat and produce gas for us. And so it takes some time. And this exercise too, where you're watching me make bread at church, that's kind of a time-oriented exercise. You know, the goal is it's not to be so literal. We're not trying to analyze every single metaphor and make every single theological point that we might possibly make out of John 6. Instead, we're just kind of trying to think and to pay attention to bread. If you're one of the more literal people and you're having trouble, I think one of the maybe more interesting ways to think right now would be, what are the things you notice that are true of bread that you know are also true of Jesus. So as we learn and we pay attention to the bread process, think about Jesus. It takes time. And, sometimes we can get excited and want a quick fix, and sometimes that's not helpful, but other times it's not such a bad thing. So one thing I do once in a while when I'm making bread is I will add a little bit of the sugar that I was going to add later. And I'll just add it to the yeast blooming process. That'll kind of get the yeast more excited. That's starting to look at least a lot closer to what we want. We could go longer, but just for fun, let's get started with our bowl and our butter. We want to heat the butter in the microwave, and if we do it in the bowl, it'll also help us warm up our bowl. So, two birds, It calls for 5 teaspoons of butter, so I'm just going to cut it right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I think about 30 seconds should do the trick. All right, I'm just going to stop it after 30 seconds. Improvisation. Okay, it's been more time than we expected, and we are not there yet. So I'm going to give it a little longer. By now, you're probably noticing, hey, this guy is a better pastor than he is a home cook. And you are absolutely right. I am not doing this because I'm excellent at baking bread. I'm not even the one who normally cooks in the house. It's something I do occasionally. But that can be helpful for the sake of this metaphor, In fact, if you have someone in your household who knows how to bake bread and is really familiar with it, this might be a good opportunity for the other person in the household who doesn't normally bake the bread to give it a try and experiment. Yeah, that looks good enough. That's not all the way melted, but it's real hot and it will melt the rest of the way. And in that time, we've got Yeast City over in our yeast. It takes longer, it turns out, when you are also filming. So I'm going to pour this yeast mixture in with my butter, and then we are going to get 1/4 of a cup of milk. This is a awkward hand position. Let's see. 1/4 of a cup. Ooh. Maybe. Oh, that's 1/3 of a cup. That's 1 cup. There's 1/4 of a cup. Okay, I spilled a little bit. That's okay. I'm leaving that in. Mistakes happen. And we want a teaspoon of salt. Is that a teaspoon? That's 1/2 teaspoon. We could use that if we needed to. Just use 2 of them. This is a teaspoon. And this is how I keep my salt. I just keep it in an old garlic jar so that I can sprinkle it. Well, you know what? I'm going to do a heaping teaspoon because I'm a rebel and I like salt. And then we're going to wipe this up, and after that we'll stir all this together. There we go. Not so bad. Turns out mistakes aren't a big deal. Here's our bowl. Here's our Stirrermeister 5000. Turns out with this chunk of butter, a whisk might have been a little bit more fun, but that's okay. It will all work out in the end, I'm confident. I've made this recipe a lot of times. That's why I chose it. It's just kind of one I started with and one I'm familiar with, so it's easier to do in front of an audience. That liquid is, it's only lukewarm because we added cold milk to it after the hot butter. So it's right on the edge of going to melt the rest of that butter. We might end up with a little bit of butter chunks and get more of a biscuit type consistency, but I'm going to hope that we can fix that with, careful kneading. So to start with, let's get 2 cups. I'm using regular all-purpose Publix bread flour. I'll try to get a good shot of this. Well, that's not as pretty when I have to film it, but that's about a cup. And that's a nice cup. That's what you're looking for. Except I knocked the camera. The measurements in baking are more precise than they are in other kinds of cooking that I frankly like better. You know, if you're out grilling, nobody's measuring the amount of barbecue sauce. But with this recipe, it's still not super precise because ultimately we're going to keep adding flour until the dough is just barely not sticking to our hands. So we do have, quantities of these things, but they're approximate. And this is where we're going to start adding flour just a little bit at a time. I like to use my big red canisters for this. When I'm adding a lot of flour, it makes sense to go right for the source. But for the red canisters, I've got my little spoon, and that's about 1/4 of a cup. And so we'll add more than 1/4 of a cup the first time, but there we go. Look at that. It's starting to get solid. Now again, I'm not teaching you how to make bread here. Most of you know how to make bread. I'm just slowing down and paying attention to the bread making process. We're just thinking about it together because Jesus is like bread. And so, what's bread like? You know, what do you need for bread? What's it mean? What's it for? And again, for some people, for a lot of the sermons, you'd rather I just explained it. I told you. But for some people, it's worth spending some time with mystery. You know, a lot of theology is mystery. And in addition to making mistakes with the bread making process, spilling things, I also make mistakes in the filming process. Sometimes I knock the camera. Sometimes I have to reshoot something. That's a part of it. That's a part of life. Let's do one more with our hands. See, I can tell once I got my hands in it that we need a lot more flour. We're not as close as we looked. So I'm gonna kind of squeeze these off, and then we'll add more. Ultimately, we want about 2.5 to 3.5 cups of flour. Were you keeping count? Because I wasn't. I could go back and watch the footage, but... You know, one analogy people make a lot about bread is that if you tried to eat any one of these ingredients, you know, if you were feeling hungry and you decided to have a bowl full of flour or a big old plate of salt or just some active dry yeast, that wouldn't be very fun. It wouldn't satisfy your appetite. But when you bring them all together, well, then we're talking about something. That'll preach, right? Get some flour on my hands. Make things stick just a little less. Yeah, now we're talking. All right, let's try this again. All right. We're still a little gloopy, but we've got some flour in the bottom of the bowl there, so it is ready for us to start kneading. Clear some space. Just flour down the table a little bit. Woo. Now kneading, of course. When you think about bread and Jesus, and you think about kneading, there's that obvious dad joke lying there, that obvious pun. So we need bread, but we also need it, right? If bread's like Jesus, you can talk about how you need a loaf of bread, you also need Jesus. And that's true. You know, we do. We need bread. We require it. If you don't eat any bread or anything else instead of bread, you're not going to live. But unfortunately, that pun doesn't really work in the Bible. You know, Jesus wasn't speaking English. He didn't have a word for what we do in the bread making process that sounded like require. He did, however, have another pun that was present in Hebrew. Even though he was speaking Greek, his audience would have been familiar with bread in Hebrew. Do you know what the Hebrew word for bread is? The word is lechem. That's easy to remember. The word for bread is lechem. If you've ever heard of the city of Bethlehem, Bethlehem is the city of bread. Literally the house of bread. Bayit lechem. So it's like calling a place bakery. There was a town in California that we used to drive through a lot on the way to Vegas called Baker. Bethlehem, house of bread. There's a lot of houses of in the ancient world anyway. Bethel, Bethany. But bread is lechem. And that's actually, you use the word bread, you use lechem to refer to any kind of food. Like it's like the basic word for food. If you're just like, man, I want to eat something, you'd say, I want to eat some bread. But then, do you know what the word in Hebrew is for life? You might have heard that if you've ever been to like a party or something. Turns out it's the word l'chaim. They use it as a toast, as a cheers. L'chaim, to life. So, Jesus says he's the bread of life, the lechem, of l'chaim. He's the bread, he's something that you eat, but you eat it, why do you eat it? Well, for life. Why do we need it? Because we need it. I think that's kind of cool. It works both ways. What are you guys thinking about? Are you talking about it in the chat? I hope you are. What are some ways in which your spiritual life can be compared to bread? Could be in the bread making process, could be in the bread eating process, could be something else about bread. Distribution, how it gets to us. Hey, where's bread come from? In John 6, Jesus wants us to be really clear about the fact that bread comes from God. Seems to us like it comes from Publix, right? Well, where's Publix get it from? Flour comes from wheat, which is the top part of a grass, which grows because God makes the sun shine and the rain fall, and because he created life, put it on this planet. And yet, bread doesn't just happen. I mean, unless you're in the wilderness with Moses, it falls from the sky. Normally, we've actually got to put some work into bread. We've got to put some kneading. We got to get involved. We got to mix things together. I'm not really making an argument. I'm not trying to lead you somewhere. I'm just noticing things. I hope you're just noticing things. All right, we are going to set this in here and leave it for about an hour. All right, it's been some time. Let's see how this rose. That's pretty good, about double the size. We'll take it out of here. And the next step is just to undo all that wonderful progress. You just kind of flatten it out, burst all the bubbles, and then roll it up. I apologize for the hammering in the background. You may hear that. That's them working on the exit. Dropped my cooking spray trying to work around this camera. Ooh, that's a lot of cooking spray. I overdid it on a corner there, but it'll be okay. And then we are going to tuck it in like this with the ends tucked around and leave that to rest for a while. While that's happening, I always like to think a step ahead, so let's preheat the oven to 400 degrees. All right, that looks to have been poofed quite a bit. Ooh, yeah, that's a lot. Well, we'll see how it looks after we cook it. Let's get it into the oven. And I'm just going to use this as a oven mitt. About 30 minutes. All right, it's about that time. Let's see how it looks. Doesn't have as much color as I would expect. Let's take a peek at it. I think it's done. Let's take a look. I always make the first piece kind of big because I want to see that the middle is done. That looks pretty good. All right, I'm going to bring some of this to my wife.
Well, I've got my bread, and I am really excited to hear from you about the thoughts and the feelings and the ideas you have had around this important metaphor of Jesus, the bread of life. So I'm going to waste no time in leading our benediction. Friends, be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go.